Well, my time with the YMCA goes back many years, more than 60 years. I can recall when I was probably about 8 years of age going of a Sunday morning with my father to the Melbourne YMCA, because my father was a volunteer with a number of other volunteers who would go in and make beds and provide services for the troops or sailors who were staying at the Y. The YMCA in those days would accommodate a troop ship or a navy ship, and they also used the premises over the road of the dance hall for additional accommodation places. And my role of a Sunday morning was following around the YMCA rep who was in charge of it. I was the messenger boy, or I'd go down into the canteen and help clear the tables or whatever. I always liked it when an American ship was in because they used to have packets of sugar-coated almonds in grease-proof paper, and if it was a good morning I'd score 2 or 3 packets of these almonds. As time went on, I was involved in running a boys' club, a church boys' club at Wattle Park, and when I took over the leadership of that, the senior leadership of that club, I went and did a course at the Melbourne YMCA on leadership training, which was about an 8-week course. From that, we improved our numbers for the club, and the following year I went back and did another advanced leadership training course. At the end of that, the conclusion of that, I was asked by Mr. Arch Anderson, would I like to put in an application for a position becoming available with the Melbourne YMCA. I put in the application and I was successful. And I was sent out to Kingswell YMCA, which was an amazing operation because the people were so supportive. We ran a kindergarten 5 mornings of the week. We had a club for boys and girls for each grade of the primary school. Then we had in secondary school a club for first formers, another one for second formers, third formers. Then we had the teenage clubs, etc. We had mothers' clubs, we had a Wisemanette's club, a Wiseman's club. It was very wonderful, and the leadership of that centre was excellent. One of our leaders of the Rovers Boys Club, second formers I think there would have been, was Ian Bryant, who played centre for Footscray, the Australian Football League. And we had a waiting list on his club for people, or boys wanting to join his club. We had Barry Bennett, who played for Essendon Football Club, another leader of the club. And this quality went right throughout. Kingswell also provided all the junior sporting teams in the area, be it tennis, netball, number of basketball teams, badminton, cricket and football. I like telling the story of especially the under-14 football team. We could basically win a game before the ball was bounced, because when we handed over the team sheet, top of the name would be E. Whitten, which was the son of Ted Whitten, who was a champion footballer at Footscray. The second name on the list would be a Tom Barassi. No relation to the Ron Barassi of the Melbourne Football Club, but we didn't tell the opposition that. And then, of course, down the bottom, we'd put in the coach. It'd be either Ted Whitten himself, the father of Edward, or Ian Bryant. And as I say, psychologically, we could win that game before the ball was bounced. Anyway, my time at Kingswell went through to 1968, and then I was appointed area director for the western suburbs, and I then moved to the West Footscray Centre and was centre manager there, as well as being the area manager. West Footscray was a different operation altogether. There was no ownership of the place by the members as such. It ran a good service, but different atmosphere altogether. While as area director in the western suburbs, I established new services, a new centre at Essendon, one at Keilor, another service at Avondale Heights and also Spotswood. In 73, 74, I introduced five-a-side soccer, indoor soccer. To do this, I went to Maury Kerwood, the sports editor of Channel 9, and asked him, did he have any video of the game so that we could work out how to play it. And they had nothing. They referred me to George Wallace of the Victorian Soccer Federation, and he couldn't help me either. But he said that he was interested in seeing the game being promoted and he would assist where possible. A day or two later, George Wallace phoned me up and said to me, if you can convince Channel 9 to telecast it, we'll provide state league teams and run a 13-week course program and get the game off the floor that way. And that turned out to be a brilliant experience. Except for the grand final of the Soccer Federation's teams, we had Footscray JUST, a Yugoslavian team playing, and we had Croatia, the Croatian team, playing in the grand final, and it was on for young and old. Ted Whitten was doing the commentary for Channel 9, and he certainly did not help the situation on the night, because when he was doing his voice warm-up, he did not realise that the house mic was on. In 1974, I was transferred to the eastern suburbs, where I was involved in, again, running the Baldwin Centre, and was area director for the eastern suburbs. We established new centres at Nuttawading and at Knox. We extended services into Doncaster, and also I was involved in setting up a camp, building a camp at McMahon's Creek, which was in conjunction with 6 YMCA centres and 6 schools, and that proved to be a good project. Later on, I was then transferred over to the Brighton YMCA to sort out a few problems there, and at the end of 1987, I decided to retire from the YMCA. After I had retired, Harold Jenner, who'd been a former National General Secretary of the YMCA, Dave Davis from Adelaide, Dave had been a senior member of the YMCA staff, and a couple of other people, we formed the former YMCA Staff Association, and we promoted that throughout Australia, and we finished up with about 200 members. I also did the quarterly journal for the YMCA former Staff Association, which was called Australian Bridges. And we also contributed to the international body of the YMCA retired staff, which their publication was Bridges. That lasted for about 20 years, and then the executive committee as such, several passed on, and so there was only a couple of us left, so we wound up that operation. After that, when I was doing the journal of the former YMCA Staff Association, one member asked me, was there any YMCA person who had served in the First World War and the Second World War? And I did not know the answer to that, so I started going through YMCA archives. I found a list of personnel for the Second World War, but discovered there was no list for First World War, or going back to the Boer War, or for Vietnam, or for Korea. So I took an interest in that, because in the early 1970s, I myself had served as a YMCA representative at Puckapunyal Army Camp. And in fact, I was the next in line to go to Vietnam. I was to do a 28-day spot in Vietnam to allow Keith Williams, who was the rep in Vietnam, to come home for 4 weeks annual leave. And then Keith would go back and resume his work. But while I was at Puckapunyal, the Australian government decided to start reducing its commitment to Vietnam. So the YMCA decided that I wasn't going to Vietnam. Keith Williams would remain in Vietnam for an extra few weeks, and he'd wrap the service up, then he'd come home. By taking an interest in the YMCA military history, that has probably taken another 20 years of my life, a task which I've greatly enjoyed because I get people making inquiries for information going back to 100 years. Probably my best story is the one of a gentleman from Adelaide. He'd been in contact with the Australian War Memorial on a number of occasions. He knew that his great-grandfather had gone to Belgium and never came home. The War Memorial informed this person that his name appeared in my records, which are kept with the Australian War Memorial, and they referred him to me. And I was able to put together the story that his great-grandfather was a YMCA representative. He'd served in France, he'd served in Belgium. He was wounded in Belgium as a rep. He was taken as a prisoner of war, and he died from his wounds as a POW. Further searching through records, I found a photo of the grave, and I sent all this information to that gentleman in Adelaide, and the following morning I had a phone call from him, and I had this 70-year-old man on the phone crying, basically with joy, wanting to know, how did I find out this information? Where did I get it from? Why did not anybody else know about this? And so that gave me a great deal of satisfaction, and that's happened many times in telling the story of YMCA reps. Another thing that cropped up, there's a soldier sailing out of Albany in Western Australia in the First World War, wrote a letter of farewell to his family. The letter was written on YMCA letterhead, Melbourne YMCA letterhead. He put it in a jar, sealed the jar and threw it overboard. And that jar was washed ashore 98 years later. And I had the West Australian paper asking me to confirm the letterhead with that letter. And so, yeah, I get these sort of inquiries which keep me going. Just recently, I had a family from England. They were inquiring again, the inquiry came through the Australian War Memorial, about their Uncle Jim, who they had not seen or heard of for 50 odd years. He'd come to Australia and they didn't know what he was doing. On receiving this request, I remember that I did a video interview with him a few years later, probably about 8 or 9 years ago. So I again went to the National YMCA office and we searched through the records and found the disc of that interview, and I sent the family a copy of it. And I got a lovely letter back from that family saying how they were able to sit in their lounge room and on their TV to hear and see their Uncle Jim and to hear what he did as a YMCA rep and his service overseas. Jim told the story, he was working with Italian prisoners of war, and he was serving refreshments, tea and coffee to them. There were 5,400 of these POWs basically kept in a barbed wire area. And one day Jim was working on his YMCA mobile canteen, trying to fix a mechanical problem he had with it, and he was having a bit of trouble. And one of the prisoners of war was standing there watching him. And this prisoner stepped in and did the task, fixed it. Jim wasn't too sure if the person had sabotaged his unit or whatever, but they formed a friendship between the two of them, and Jim said he finished up by having the best maintained mobile canteen in the business. So basically that's been my YMCA story. I'm still continuing with the YMCA military history. I enjoy doing that. It gives me a lot of satisfaction to be able to go through the records and to collate those records and put them into some form of order, because it's never been done in the past, and I hope that the work I'm putting in will continue in the future.